Want to learn about public policy with a group of curious fellow learners? Apply for the 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Early bird deadline closes 27th July.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. My name is Kripa, Koshy, and I'm a program manager at the Takshashila Institution. I'm joined today by a colleague also from our policy school. Welcome, Leah.
Hi everyone, my name is Leah Govias. I'm an assistant program manager for the Graduate Certificate of Public Policy, Defense and Foreign Affairs program at the Takshashila Institution.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah, for introducing yourself. I'm sure you're already a familiar name to those who might have been listening to HP for a bit. But special thank you for joining me today to discuss what might be a slightly unconventional topic that might not be thought of through a policy lens necessarily, but it's to specifically talk about the Elgin Marbles, right? We have seen it come up regularly in the news. We see how it's sort of a point of contestation between the United Kingdom and Greece. So I just thought, as someone who has a fair bit of interest in art, I think you would be sort of a great person to chat with about some of your views on this and to sort of discuss some of the key arguments that have sort of come up and have been raised really by both sides in this debate, to hear some of your sort of views, to sort of give a summary of how the issue has played out so far. While it might not be perhaps very explicitly, we cannot conclude maybe our time together with a formal recommendation of any kind, but I just thought it would be sort of a good forum to discuss some of these considerations. So I was thinking, really our bigger question is, what response should contemporary governments or institutions like museums have when there are claims of ownership that come by other governments or foreign governments, right? So as I said earlier, we just want to unpack together some of the sort of seems like fairly complex considerations in this conversation on deaccession, which is sort of this idea of returning property to its original or quote unquote original communities that hosted these pieces, right? So a little bit of context setting, I think, for those who might not know too much about it. Would you like to share, I think, a little bit about when we speak of the Elgin Marbles, what really we are referring to?
Yeah, so the Elgin Marbles are more than 30 ancient stone sculptures from Greece that are being held at the British Museum, and they date back to more than 2,000 years. They were transported to Britain in the early 1800s by Thomas Bruce, who was the 7th Earl of Elgin. And he was the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in Constantinople, which controlled Athens until 1832. And the controversy around it was that Lord Elgin insisted that he had permission to remove the sculptures from the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Athens at the time. But the original letter giving him permission to do so has been lost, and the wording of it remains somewhat disputed. So the British government bought the sculptures from Lord Elgin in 1816 for the display in the British Museum for about £35,000. When Greece became independent in 1835, the government asked the UK to return them. So, that's a bit of context setting and the controversy around it. So there was a negotiation that began between Athens and the British Museum in 2021 with an extended loan of the sculptures to Athens in mind. And that was in return for a temporary transfer of some Greek treasures to Britain. As of December last year as well, the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer hosted the Prime Minister of Greece in London. And just as the British Museum announced, it had been holding constructive negotiations with Athens over the return of the marbles. And There were Germany and Italy, this was in 2006 and 2022, have already returned some fragments from the Parthenon to Athens over
Mm-hmm.
the next 20 years. So that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so, but I think the major portion of it is in the British Museum, which is what they're campaigning to have returned back to Athens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, as much as I know you've sort of touched on the more contemporary timeline of this, as you had said earlier, this has been a contentious issue for a long while, right?
Yeah.
And so we just want to unpack, I think, together some of the considerations. I think prior to this, Leah and I were discussing this article that came in the Atlantic recently that was essentially trying to grapple with some of the concerns in this particular case of these Elgin marbles, right? So one of the questions that they pose there is, does art belong essentially to all of humanity, or is it fundamentally rooted in the particular culture in which it was produced? So, I mean, I have some thoughts, but I'd love to hear what your instinctive response to that is, Leah.
Right. So, I mean, the argument has been made both ways in this case, as in this particular case with the Elgin marbles. So, on one side, those in the UK believe that it belongs in the British Museum because it's a part of a massive collection within the museum that kind of
Mm,
is a snapshot into the history of humankind and art and progress and different things. And
mm,
whereas the argument, especially for the Greeks, is that it's a part of their culture, they're part of their tradition, they're a part of their history. And there are arguments for the universality of art and art as rooted in a particular culture. So, for it belonging to all of humanity, there's like you have the shared human experience where art kind of communicates universal emotions of love, fear, joy, loss, a lot of which is captured within these sculptures. And, there's the global influence and exchange over centuries. Art styles, techniques, ideas have been borrowed. It kind of,
mm,
a lot of art over the years, if you see during, Renaissance paintings, Baroque paintings in Europe at the time, you see a lot of influences of classical arts. And this is an example of where it originated from.
mhm, mhm,
And then there's the access and appreciation, in the digital age. While you may be able to see a photograph of a painting, there's a lot that comes across when you see it in its
in
uh,
person. Mm,
yeah, in person. Like for example, there was the Caravaggio painting that was in Bangalore on
mm,
6th of July, and of course, I had only seen pictures of it online, and I had my own little thoughts and I read a little bit about it. But when I saw it with a friend of mine, there was so much that we uncovered that we hadn't seen,
mm,
and things like symbols and messages that you can only see at certain angles when you look at the canvas, right? And that wouldn't have been possible for me to do if it had not been moved around from country to country on this exhibition. If it hadn't come to India, I might not have seen it as someone who may at the present maybe doesn't have the opportunity to, let's say, travel to Europe and see all these things, right? So and then there's the moral vision, where some argue that great art taps into moral or existential truths, where you kind of, there's like a message about the state of the human condition that speaks to all of humanity, which is why art needs to be a universal thing that everyone can experience. Then there's the other argument entirely, where art is rooted in a particular culture. So you have the cultural context where art is embedded in the social, historical, and spiritual conditions of its origin. Again, with respect to the sculpture, the Elgin marbles, rather, it's it's one of the oldest and finest examples of Greek classical art.
mm,
It was a part of a temple dedicated to Athena, one of the Greek goddesses. And so it is deeply embedded within specific traditions and mythology connected to the Greek culture. And like I mentioned before, because of how historically like relevant the art is, and that it was borrowed, the certain style of classical Greek art was borrowed by so many artists after that, it's important to some people that it is kept in its place of origin.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's also claiming that art belongs to everyone can justify appropriation, like using cultural works without permission or respect. And in this case, also the Elgin marbles were taken away by a colonial power, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's the argument for that. And then some communities see art not as an object for global appreciation, but as a sacred or private cultural possession. So for them, the outside access can feel like intrusion or theft. Yeah. So those are the arguments that are made for it. Yeah. If whether art does belong to all of humanity or it's rooted in a particular culture. But I mean, there's so. I mean, I think that it's a very split in the middle kind of argument where you can't really choose a side here. But the
Mm-hmm.
question really isn't who owns art, but how we approach it, maybe with curiosity, humility, and responsibility. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think it frames some of the considerations that we'll also go into through the time we have together. I think for me, maybe the response I can instinctively have is that art can be appreciated, I think, by all of humanity and should, in fact, people should have the opportunity to fully appreciate art, regardless of, where its origin is or where you might be appreciating it from. But I think the appeal of it is also sometimes because it is fundamentally rooted in a particular culture. The value of the Elgin Marbles also comes largely from the fact that it depicts a very particular, like you said, sliver of Greek history or Greek mythology, to be maybe more specific. And actually, that is sort of one of the most appealing aspects of it, right? I think if it were not rooted so firmly in its culture of origin, its appreciation would look very different, I think. Not to say that
Yeah.
not all art has to be rooted in a particular culture,
Yeah.
but that actually lends to the appeal of the artwork itself, right? And actually, this goes, if we're talking about appreciation, I think another question I wanted to sort of discuss was, an argument that's come up often is that the Elgin marbles can only truly be, if we were to truly aesthetically appreciate it, it is only when it is reunited as a whole. And so if we speak to some of that, right, like, do you in fact feel like it needs to be appreciated in this unified piece? If we speak of something like the concept of art that's on the move, the way you sort of spoke of in touring exhibits, if there were parts of it that were sort of in different parts of the world, that doesn't allow for that full appreciation maybe as it's being moved. I think the other idea is there's been this argument of integrity that's come up, that the Parthenon sculptures itself are not actually portable antiquities. It's not like a manuscript that's being moved from place to place.
Yeah.
And nor were they conceived to be, sold off to a particular patron or to be available in an art market per se. It's actually considered to be a piece of the sculptures itself are a piece of the Parthenon, which in turn, like you had alluded to earlier, Leah, was, it's part of the landscape in which it is set very uniquely.
Yeah.
So what are your sort of thoughts on that? Like, can art, this particular art perhaps, be truly appreciated only when it's united and in this holistic manner?
I mean, the sculptures were not, I would say, they were not meant, they're not portable antiquities. They're actually quite massive. And they were not conceived or executed to be passed into possession of a patron or to be bought and sold on the art
Mm-hmm.
market. They are an integral part of the Parthenon, and it's a part of their landscape. It's natural, man-made, and I think sculpted over several years with great care. I think it would impact also the structural integrity of the statue if it had to be moved around from place to place as well. I don't think it's the kind
Mm,
of piece of art that can be moved. Um,
mm,
so that is, I think, something to be taken into consideration. Um,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I see the point that you're trying to make. I think to be helpful now that you sort of touched on that is to talk about the precedent setting argument, right? So um, usually, one of those who are in opposition for reputation say that, look, once we open the floodgates here, there's no going back. Really that there are other claims that will come up. Especially
Yeah.
when we see that pieces that sit foreign cultures that are represented sometimes in erstwhile colonial country museums
Yeah.
still are a symbol of some sort of cultural
Yeah.
domination, really, and sort of there's this ethnocentric concern that usually comes up. Um,
And there's also
so
the case for the
mhm.
Kohinoor diamond to be returned to India as well.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, and I mean, see, this is something that's in such common popular parlance, right? Like we discuss it. There is a popular narrative that exists on some of this already. There is this understanding that that if there are objects of cultural value that exist outside of the culture in which it originated, that's problematic. That's by and large a lot of the public view on some of this.
yeah.
But what are your thoughts on, I guess, precedent setting, right? Like we've seen several examples of, I mean, even you alluded to earlier in the introduction, right, where you spoke of Italy and Germany have actually returned fragments from the Parthenon to Athens already. So
Yeah.
these movements are already a part of the conversation. The idea of loans from governments or museums from one museum to another is fairly common practice. Usually it's not very, there's not too much public fanfare that happens around it. It's done fairly quietly. But this
Yes.
idea of loaning also exists, right? So do you feel
Yeah.
like it sets a precedent in some way? Your general thoughts on other claims that could come up for pieces to be repatriated? I think maybe if I could start with my point of view, and then I'd
Yeah.
love to hear what you had to think on this as well. But I mean, I think we're too far in this conversation already, right? Like this idea of, I think repatriation is no longer, precedent setting, I don't think is the same, doesn't hold the same type of sway as an argument as it maybe did in the past. And
Yeah.
as we said, Elgin Marbles conversations has been going on for, easily several decades.
Yes.
But we already are in a reality where countries are returning objects to host, or countries of origin already are returning art pieces. There is, or sometimes it's portions of it that might be returned, or there are some sort of agreements that are being set in place. So I don't think this actually is nearly as stressful a consideration for governments that are considering returning pieces of art to their countries of origin.
Yeah.
What are
Yeah.
your sort of general thoughts?
I think so. In the case of Germany and Italy as well, they were smaller pieces of the Parthenon sculpture that returned. So I think its significance maybe was a lot less compared to the Parthenon sculptures, which is a massive portion of them that are in the British Museum. So I think it was a little easier maybe to make that decision to repatriate those pieces of the sculpture. We've also seen a few more examples, and we discussed this before this as well, where a bronze statue was returned to India last year. And again, I mean, if we look going back to that legal precedent. Argument that we had, this was not a part of the British Museum and therefore doesn't come under the National Heritage, the British Museum Act rather. And so I think to be able to send that bronze statue back, or the pieces of the Parthenon sculptures back from Germany and Italy, I think it was easier to do for those pieces of art.
Yeah.
I would say that the other claims, there are arguments that museums are symbols of cultural domination, right? As I mentioned previously. And the British government has also gone on the record to say that they don't have plans to change the law that would permit a permanent move, and that the case of decisions relating to the care and management of and sculptures are a matter of for the trustees of the British Museum. So, which is operationally independent of the British government. So, it's it's a tricky situation because we're not dealing with again, like, even though Keir Starmer and the prime minister, the Greek government as well as is discussing this issue. I think ultimately it has to be the trustees of the British Museum that makes that decision. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's tough to get into some of the legal considerations on it because we can't speak very authoritatively, perhaps. But I mean, um, yeah, I think the issue of management and care is because the Greek government has gone on record to argue for the return of the marbles on the grounds that it's not being properly cared for in the
Yeah.
museum. So I think there is an effort from the government side to distance themselves for being accountable in that way for care of the pieces itself. So which is why I think it was raised.
Yeah.
But yeah, insofar as the way forward, I think time will tell, right? Like we'll have to see. This has been a point of contention, as we said earlier on, for so long. I
Yeah.
think it would be really fantastic for these pieces to be appreciated in its original context, while also recognizing that there's so much value in intercultural exchange that could happen. And that's where this idea of loaning pieces might happen, or there's room for replicas to be made available in order to appreciate some of the nuances that typically, rather than saying that a country would be a country that's returning a piece, rather than think of it in terms of it being robbed of the opportunity for its own audiences to appreciate that art, there's actually opportunity to say, can we conceive of art maybe in terms of replicas being created to be appreciated also in a certain way, or like you mentioned earlier, as much as a digitally accessible version might not be ideal, could it still be a step in the direction of being able to provide access to people who might not typically see a piece in person, perhaps, right, in their own country?
Yeah.
So there are many considerations here, and I think we could spend much longer discussing some of that, but I think in the interest of time, we'll sort of end our conversation over here. I just want to thank you for the chance to discuss this. I think it was a really cool topic to sort of engage with, to hear some of your thoughts and even your personal reflections of chances where you've had to interact with original pieces. I think it really lends to some of the personal connection that people do have when they approach art in person, right? So thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much. This was a really great discussion, and I hope there's a lot of takeaways for people tuning in to this episode of All Things Policy. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.